The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on historical mapping and hints and tips. My name is George Burden. I am the commercial manager at Groundsure. I'm just going to make sure that the slides are visible. So at this point, you should have a view of a map, obviously with the title page as well. Please do get back to me if you're having any problems with audio or with the visual, and you feel free to use the questions and chat function if you want to raise any sort of queries, and otherwise we'll just give it another minute for people to come on board and then we'll get cracking. All right, well, let's get started. So if you're using the webinar software, you'll notice there's a grey panel with an orange arrow at the top of it. If it's pointing right, then you have an expanded view. If it's pointing left, you have what's called a contracted view, which just means you may need to expand it to view the chat function options. At this stage, I think we have about 70 people online, so it's terrific to have you all here today. Thank you very much for attending, and I hope that's an indication of the fact that we're bringing in webinars which cover new topics that people are hankering to understand, but please do respond. There'll be a webinar sort of survey sent out after this. We welcome your thoughts and feedback and would love to know if there's other topics you want us to cover. This is a nice, short, punchy little update, so we're just going to cover off a few tips and a bits of detail in relation to Ordnance Survey mapping, and let's get started. So obviously, first point here is just to examine what Ordnance Survey are. It was founded in 1791. Main driving purpose was to map militarily important areas following the Jacobite Rebellion in the Scottish Highlands in 1745 and the Napoleonic Wars, spanning 1803 to 1815. The Victorians saw the benefits of these maps for social and industrial planning, and in 1841, the OS Survey Act formalised the OS into law and granted the right to enter any land for purposes of surveying. I've been with the business about 6 years and started out really just making master map and historical mapping available to the likes of architects and surveyors, and really just love these sort of maps. Our collection itself is an excellent one, digitized at sort of highest rate on the market, 500 dots per inch, and I just quite like making them available to people for sort of their own homes and sort of sites of historic significance. It's just a wonderful little tool we have. And for myself, I grew up in West London, and when I was looking through the maps, where I used to live was pretty much part of Chiswick House grounds for a long time, and then I think the owner of the manor or what have you sort of had gambling debts and things like that, and then the areas were sold off, and then you come across big A roads sort of cutting right through it. But I don't need to tell you guys benefits of OS maps, that's why you're here. So obviously the OS are responsible for naming conventions. Formerly places may have had more than one name or be spelled in various ways. So we've got a big comprehensive collection of about 1.5 million sheets. These were sourced directly from the OS Survey in Southampton as well as Trinity College in Dublin. So firstly, we just wanted to touch on petrol stations. They only tend to be labelled as such on large scale mapping, so 1 to 2500 or 1250. They'll only be labelled as a filling station or a petrol station if no other services are offered. So if they're selling food or something like that, they can be labelled as a garage. Now, if this is the case, you need to definitely know if petrol is sold. So there are a few distinctive features to look out for. And whilst it may be obvious for existing petrol stations, some that have been converted may not be as clear. Now, if you're using Google Street View, for example, or undertaking a site investigation, a few obvious features to look out for would be things like interceptors. As you can see here, normally shown as several covers, and there'll be 3 in series. And the other point, of course, is things like vent stacks or offset fills, which normally neighbor the vent stacks. And obviously, that's where they're actually putting the petrol in, or the fuel in, I should say. And obviously, the number of sort of inlets suggests how many tanks may be underground as well. Another sort of telltale sign when you're looking at historic mapping would be perhaps if the site has 2 entrances or exits. And of course, if you're looking at a canopy, as these are open-sided structures, then they'll be represented on the mapping with a dashed line rather than a solid line, as such can be seen on the image here. I'm just going to pause to make sure we haven't had any questions or any issues in terms of tech or audio, but everyone looks good, so let's proceed. Another obvious sign, of course, as I mentioned, would be the vent pipes. So perhaps they, when converted to use like a car wash, The interceptors and the vent pipes are usually left in situ, so it's a nice clear indicator when undertaking a site investigation as well. And for those that aren't familiar, vent pipes often appear as these sort of structures, perhaps standing independently, and often, will be near a car park, because naturally, with the offset fills, you need to get a sort of tanker up near. So moving on to heaps and pits. Now, the OS survey 6-inch maps, so that's 1 to 10,000 and 10,560, record practically all man-made and natural features in the landscape. So every road, railway, field, fence, wall, stream, and building is shown, even including smaller features like letterboxes, bollards on quaysides, mileposts, and flagstaffs. So uncultivated land is distinguished by over 10 different symbols for types of woodland, birch, fern, mixed firs, brushwood, as well as marsh, bog, and rough grassland. So the permanent detail of quarries, pits, slag heaps, and refuse tips is shown with the type of mineral extracted named before around 1859, I believe. So a few tips just sort of distinguishing between heaps and pits. The terminology we're trying to employ here really is just to demonstrate that the tapering indicates, the incline. So the largest or thickest part of the slope symbol indicates the part that would be closest to you if you were examining it from a bird's eye point of view. So I know it can be sometimes tricky to establish, but as you can see, obviously the lines are thickening out here, suggesting a raised area and a depression in this instance. Now, there are some quite distinguishing features of what tend to be slag heaps or refuse heaps, and these are usually represented as a sort of collection of small dots. Obviously, you can infer what these have been filled in with based on the surrounding land uses, such as evidenced here. But these are the sort of the dotted symbology that we're referring to. So issues associated with embankments. Now, if they're in proximity to, say, a gasworks, they may have used gasworks waste as an engineering material, particularly foul lime. And with things like cuttings, these are often infilled when the rail line was removed. So many smaller rail lines were closed around the 1960s, prior to the Control of Pollution Act in 1974, and therefore could have been subject to uncontrolled waste deposition. Of course, again, you can also notice the tapering, and I think in this instance, the squiggly line obviously varies from, say, pits and heaps to distinguish the feature. So local knowledge can go a long way, and we know that many of the heaps in areas of like Widnes, Halton, Runcorn, and pretty nasty. They are more than likely filled with a chemical waste known as galagoo, and galagoo is a byproduct of a process that converted rock salt into sodium carbonate. So galagoo contains high levels of arsenic and other heavy metals. Now, as well as the pollutions risk posed, it's also an uncontrolled disposal in areas surrounding the factories resulted in significant ground stability problems. So it's estimated that the production process produced 2 tons of galagoo for every 1 ton of soda ash, and at its height in the 1870s, Britain's soda output was about 200,000 tons annually, and that exceeded the rest of the world combined. So the resulting millions of tons of waste galagoo were either dumped into soil heaps or spread on the ground surface to infill valleys or even build embankments. So hundreds of hectares of Widnes, Runcorn, and St Helens are underlain by this waste, which places a significant constraint on development because of its unique physical properties. So one of the examples we have is in the 1970s, the St Michael's golf course was created on the northern section of a former chemical tip, and this was for industrial waste products. So following some minor reclamation work, the southern 9 holes were established in the 80s when environmental standards had started to improve. However, evidence arose of contamination in Seward Brook, which ran through the golf course. There's a particularly charming name the locals had for it. I'm not entirely sure I'm actually allowed to say it here, but I would highly recommend that you look it up. And of course, this sort of flow was so corrosive, if your golf ball fell into it, it wasn't coming back. So in 2004, studies were undertaken on the brook and the wider course, which led to partial closure of the course in 2004. And in 2009, the council successfully obtained about 2.47 million of funding for the remediation of the northern section. So 2016, after the creation of the new course, it finally reopened to the public 12 years after its initial closure. So wartime and secret sites. Now, Stanley Baldwin, first Earl Baldwin of Bewdley, was a British Conservative statesman who dominated the government of the United Kingdom between the World Wars and served as Prime Minister on 3 occasions. Censorship of mapping started in about 1927 with the well-founded fears of obviously a wartime aerial blitz, and around that time the Prime Minister warned the bomber will always get through. Now, he secretly instructed that no work of defence shall appear, as the quote says, upon any map on sale to the general public. No blank space shall appear, but the natural physical features of the country shall continue to appear. So map makers obviously protested there was no point in deleting certain elements, such as, say, a power station, because these power lines were converging on a mysteriously blank spot. Now, as I'll show you on the following slides, some of these were clearly more successful in terms of concealment than, say, others. Now, this is ROF Risley. It was a large World War II Royal Ordnance factory, and it was used for filling munitions, including the Grand Slam bomb. Now, it's located roughly halfway between Liverpool and Manchester. The location, of course, was chosen because the low-lying mist and cloud actually helped camouflage the factory from the air. And according to a local builder, it was very lonely and misty at night, and that's, of course, why they built it there, and it was usually covered with a mist or cloud. So one of the features common to all of the filling factories was an area of storage bunkers where the finished munitions were stored awaiting dispatch. So the areas within the filling factories were all numbered in the same way, and storage bunkers were always designated Area 9. So Risley had 20 such bunkers, and Area 9 is roughly in the area of the main field that you can see here in Birchwood Forest Park today. So when the new town area of Birchwood was created, most of the bunkers were demolished, but 4 of them were left in place and can still be seen. So a number of bunkers were also built to house the munitions and to protect them from potential bombing, and also to segregate the site and really just reduce the consequences of any sort of accidental explosions during manufacture or storage. So although these bunkers are on the surface, they're covered with soil and turf, and it obviously gives the impression of them being subterranean. It had a dedicated rail link to the Manchester-Wigan branch line, which was used both for bringing in workers and also moving materials as well. But as we touched upon, obviously, these rather large, conspicuous open areas can often be quite indicative, shall we say. Now, whether it's sort of Cold War paranoia or legitimate security concern, it was further decided in 1957 that all descriptions of factories, works, mills, and collieries would be erased and replaced with generic terms. So, for example, an asbestos roofing works, as delineated on mapping, would thereafter be referred to as a works only. So whilst this was relaxed around 1964, descriptions were only permitted if it's, quote, quite clear these are unlikely to change, and also must be only in the most general terms. So whilst many factories were used for military purposes were already and continued in industrial use, historical mapping will not give you the full picture of these activities undertaken there. So Sutton Oak Factory in St Helens was used in World War I for the manufacture of synthetic phenol, and latterly for the manufacture of chemical warfare agents like sarin gas, mustard gas, and many other experimental chemical agents, really until its closure in 1957. So during both World War I and World War II, many sites in existing industrial use were requisitioned for use as ordnance factories, shell filling factories, explosives manufacture, chemical warfare manufacture, and other uses to support the war effort. In most cases, these wartime uses would not have been detailed on any maps and survive only as local knowledge, and of course within National Archive records. Now, Groundsure have undertaken independent research to identify many of these secret sites, both sort of from Royal Ordnance factories to chemical warfare manufacturers. The database currently holds hundreds of sites covering 16,830 hectares of land within England, Wales, and Scotland. Future research projects will add sites on a rolling basis, and these sites appear across the country, from things like chemical weapons research establishments at Portreath in Cornwall to RAF Kinloss near Elgin in Morayshire. So this detail can be found in our Enviro Insight as part of our sort of historical land use database, basically. So just a couple other tips and features on the layout to look out for, sort of indicative of military sites. So things like obviously the lack of labelling, perhaps maybe a depot will be indicated. You've got lots of embankments to obviously protect against risk in terms of explosions, and a very regimented layout, as obviously often is accompanied with military design, and of course large gaps in between the structures, both for, perhaps risk of explosion internally, but also to make it harder to damage them all en masse, say from a bombing run. So during the Cold War, the Ministry of Defense listed 4,800 key points that needed to be deleted. So Martin Furnival Jones, who became head of MI5, was very concerned about saboteurs. He wanted oil refineries, gasworks, and railway bridges removed, and even insisted on all factories having their role concealed because it could be useful to any agent. Now, this, of course, is the origin of the uninformative word works appearing on maps to this day. So I suppose the main thing to highlight is whilst these features may not be labelled, they do stand out by being shaded in black. And that can be applied to several of these features shown here. So mills can be an industrial building, really any industrial buildings, especially in the north of England. So there is sometimes a perception that mills just mean relatively benign things like flour mills, corn mills, and the like, but they can literally be any industrial use. And as you'll see on the following slides, it's definitely something to keep an eye out for. So this is the Acre Mill, and it's in the old town of Hebden Bridge. In 1859, the site of the Acre Mill was chosen to house a cotton mill. And this was mainly because of the plentiful water supply, but less than a decade later, it became a site that I think people would probably rather forget. So in 1939, Cape Insulation Limited took over the site. They were an asbestos processing company. So they mined asbestos in South Africa, and they were exporting it to Europe for widespread use as insulation and to produce obviously things like fire retardant goods. Asbestos sheet cement, of course, would be another element, rope lagging, insulation mattresses, asbestos cloth and yarn, or all these sort of things were produced at the site. So Cape Insulation Limited took over the site to meet the demands for producing filters for gas masks during World War II, and they occupied the site until 1970. Now, the mill was the subject of a 1971 World in Action investigation entitled The Dust at Acre Mill. And what this revealed was that the factory actually broke the law regarding asbestos dust control between 1940 to 1970. And by 1979, very regrettably, 12% of a total of 2,200 former employees had asbestos-related disease. So the mill was demolished in 1979. Now you can see on the mapping here, the site was never actually labelled as an asbestos mill, and obviously this just reinforces the need to exercise caution when interpreting historical mapping. And as we say, the word mill can really be applied to multiple industrial uses. I'm just going to pause for a moment. I'm conscious we're moving towards the end, and I just want to make sure I haven't missed any questions or queries. No, all good, cool. So moving on, just a few more types of mills that we've seen on the mapping we thought might be helpful to demonstrate. Just so you're aware, this is being recorded as well, and if anyone would like a copy of the video, we're more than happy to circulate that following this. Of course, if you want to review the slides, or if you'd like to share this with a colleague, or just retain it for further reflection, or to hear my voice in future. Now, you can also infer the type of the mill from its locality, of course. So a lot of corn mills were located in rural areas, naturally, and maps such as this, it's difficult to be certain what the exact use was. So in these instances, our large-scale mapping can definitely come in handy, and that's obviously why we make the packs available with large and small. So here's the same mill, but using the large-scale mapping, the high-detailed mapping. As you can see, it's clearly labelled as a corn mill, and obviously the risks of contamination from this type of industry is much lower than if, of course, it was an asbestos mill, for example. Although I'd love to understand what sort of complications inhaling corn could. Sorry, I'll move on. So again, just as a reminder, in terms of open-sided structures, they're usually presented on mapping with small dashed lines, as you can see here. And as we mentioned, that's obviously a good way of understanding if, for example, you're looking at a petrol station. So, how to identify possible bomb damage to an area? So on the 14th of November 1940, the Luftwaffe launched its most devastating bombing raid of the Second World War so far. The target was Coventry, a manufacturing city, obviously, in the heart of England, with a beautiful medieval centre. That's a nice summary. The result was a shocking collapse of social order that caused thousands to flee, with thousands of homes and industries destroyed or damaged. So, without official bomb damage maps, can historical OS maps give you an indication of where bombs were dropped? Drum roll. Yes, historical maps serve a very useful purpose. So this is a map of Coventry from 1949, post-war, and you can clearly see how many ruins there are labelled on the maps. And of course, the label ruin on a historical map implies war damage and the possible need even for a UXO assessment. I'm sure if you speak to people such as SafeLane, they'll be more than happy to explain to you the interesting features that are associated with the sort of substrata in places like London, and the manner with which bombs could potentially penetrate the soil undetonated and actually rebound on the sort of clay underneath. I think it was, yeah, it's clay, isn't it? And then sort of, be discovered perhaps even a mile away from their initial entry point. Sort of fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. So that really comes to the end of the sort of general points and tips. As I say, we are trying to make this short and snappy and just give you some ideas. There are several useful resources hyperlinked here, and we've included, of course, a link to our historic mapping legend, as well as a link for mapping abbreviations and symbols. There's a really useful book called the Ordnance Survey Maps, a concise guide for historians. And at Groundsure, this book probably comes out almost on a daily basis. It's held in very high regard. It's extremely helpful. And then, of course, on top of that, you also have us, the Groundsure team, with a wealth of in-house experts who are on hand to answer all your questions with regards to mapping and data. So just as a reminder, in terms of what we make available to you, our mapping is based on site size, but it starts at £125 for all scales. That's assuming you don't want to buy it alongside, say, our Enviro or Geo, at which point it does actually become even more cost effective to purchase all three if you do require them, and you can buy an entire bundle for under a hectare at £160. The other point we're trying to demonstrate here is really just the quality. I mean, we truly believe that we've set an industry standard with our maps and, of course, the data associated, but predominantly the maps here. We digitized them later than anyone else that we're aware of, so basically we had better equipment to hand at the time. So our maps are scanned in at what's called 500 dpi, which is dots per inch, but really, in terms of real-world interest, the point is that they're in color, and they are extremely just high quality. So when you zoom in, they don't tend to pixelate, and you can often decipher quite minute wording and really just understand exactly what you're looking at. So with a view to keeping this short and sweet, that ends our mapping update. As I say, please do let us know what you think and if you have any other areas you want us to cover. But at this stage, I'd just like to say thank you all very much for coming along and listening to me today. I hope it was useful and of interest, and look forward to any thoughts and feedback that you have in the future. I'm going to end the webinar at this stage. Anyone who requires a copy of the video, please do get in touch. I'd be more than happy to email something over to you. It takes me a little time just to convert the file, but if you want to either respond to the survey email, or if you need to reach out to me directly for any reason, please just email george.burden, that's BURDON, @groundsure.com. And I hope you all have a superb day and enjoy your Thursday. Take care.